All right, everybody, hold on. If you thought last week's episode on tariffs and closing the de minimis loophole was intense and fun, then you're going to be really excited this week. We are talking about PCI compliance, and not just PCI compliance in general, but some recent changes. Now, you're probably saying, okay, I'm not excited about PCI compliance. And I would even challenge you, when is the last time you even thought about PCI compliance? And if you haven't had to do an SAQ or the whole scanning process or anything like that recently, but you haven't even thought about PCI compliance, well, probably ever. But it is important. Obviously, there are some big fines involved if you have a breach and you're not PCI compliant. And there are many payment gateways out there that still charge you higher rates or additional fees if you have not completed the PCI compliance process. What I want to talk about today specifically, though, is PCI is all about, especially for e-commerce merchants, the data security standards. So it's called PCI DSS. And there is a new version. There's a new version, PCI DSS 4.0. A lot of you security experts out there, payment experts out there are probably saying, yeah, that was announced years ago. This isn't new. This isn't news. However, there were a lot of more complex standards and requirements in that version that the card industry said, hey, we'll just call those best practices until March 31st, 2025. So the most intense requirements of this new version of the PCI compliance standards didn't take effect until earlier this year. And unfortunately, a lot of merchants, especially if they haven't gone through their PCI compliance renewal cycle recently or since then, they aren't even aware of those changes. So want to dive in and make you aware of those changes so you can make sure that you aren't in for a surprise if you have a breach or just the next time you're up to renew your PCI compliance. Lots of times when there are new versions, there's updates to standards, it's not necessarily a good thing. Lots of times it's more bureaucracy, more paperwork, more things to check off. But I will say there are some positive changes in the new version of the PCI data security standards. There's a customized approach now, so you can design your own controls to meet the standard's objectives. It was very prescriptive. It basically said, you must do it this way. There are now the flexibility to provide your own controls to meet the standards. However, you do have to then provide evidence showing that your custom controls reduce risk. There's also a lot more around vulnerability management that is required. So under the last versions of version 3 of the standard, you only had to fix critical and high risk vulnerabilities. So if you've done one of these scans before, you know that even on a secure site, you may get this nice long list of vulnerabilities, but when you look, they are classified as low risk or informational only, or different scanners call it different things, but basically they are items that realistically aren't going to be exploited, and even if they were exploited, aren't actually going to cause any harm. So before, you can ignore those. And I will say there were some providers out there that were a little dishonest here, and they would try to convince you that, oh no, you need to pay to have every single thing on this report fixed, or you're not going to be PCI compliant. It's all that scare tactics, all that fear, uncertainty, and doubt that some people like to prey on merchants with. But realistically, under version 3, you actually only had to fix the critical and high risk vulnerabilities. Version 4 now requires that all vulnerabilities must be fixed. So when you run those scans, you have to fix everything. And this is where having a scan tool or a scan provider that is following the best practices, but is honest and is not trying to just create more work for themselves or their partner agencies can be so important, because everything on their report you're going to have to fix. So if they have tuned things to where they're generating a report that shows you hundreds of vulnerabilities, you got to fix all of those now. There's also a new emphasis on malware and phishing controls. So all removable media must be scanned for malware. That's a best practice anyway, but I'm glad they called that out. And your staff must now receive annual training on social engineering. And I think that's just, again, a good best practice, especially if you have staff that is touching credit card information, or even if they're not, the scams out there, your accounts payable team, for instance, there's so many scams where social engineering will take place and they'll say, oh, I'm this vendor that you usually pay, but I need you to update my bank account. Our bank information has changed. Send it to this account instead. and actually it's a scam, and they now take that vendor's payments. There's even, it's been around a little while now, a few years now, but those scam texts where they will pretend to be an executive at a company that you work for and tell you, hey, I'm in an important meeting and I need a client gift. I need you to go buy a gift card and send me the code on it immediately. Scam. But there's also some more sophisticated ones out there, and that's where this annual training on social engineering, I think, is pretty valuable. But again, there's going to be places out there that are going to sell you the $1 million package of social engineering training under the banner of you must do this to be PCI compliant. And then there's other options that are going to be more affordable and deliver just as much or more value in that social engineering training. So be careful, buyer beware as you are looking to make sure you're compliant with these new standards. There's also now mandatory multi-factor authentication for accounts with access to cardholder data environments. Again, this is just an IT security best practice in this day and age if you're not already using multi-factor authentication. I know that, for instance, Adobe Commerce, that's baked right in to where your admin access is tied to a multi-factor authentication setup. Even Gmail uses this. Everybody uses this. So not a huge burden necessarily unless you've never done multi-factor authentication in your business. But even then, there are a lot of services and providers out there that make this affordable and simple to roll out. Few other big or important updates: keeping an inventory of cryptographic keys, mitigating e-commerce skimming attacks, and automating log reviews. And on those log reviews, again, there's some PCI compliance focused services that are pretty expensive and a little bit of overkill. And there are some great log review services that we have used for years just to help keep sites tuned up and running well that are a lot more affordable. So if you are looking for an automated log review solution, please reach out to me. I can connect you with a few options that are going to be a little more affordable and just as effective as some of the other stuff I'm seeing in the marketplace right now. Now, you might be saying, oh, I don't want to deal with all this. Too bad. If you don't deal with this, then you can be faced with fines. You can have increased transaction fees. You could even have your merchant account terminated. Probably the biggest reason is non-compliant merchants can be fined up to $100,000 per month. So Visa, MasterCard, and the rest of the payment card industry are serious about this. Please be compliant. Also, it's just best practice. So version 4 requires documenting and monitoring all the scripts on your payment page, so where the cardholder data is processed. And this is important because there are merchants that I have seen where they're compromised due to a vulnerable third-party script, and they don't even notice that a new script, new JavaScript has been injected in and is skimming credit card numbers. So following these best practices, they're there for a reason. They're in the requirements for a reason. They will protect you. They will protect your customers. I think the biggest thing, while we've gotten a little numb as consumers about having our credit card data stolen, unfortunately, because it's become so common, it does hurt your reputation, especially if you're a smaller or mid-sized e-commerce brand. If you have a breach because you are non-compliant with PCI compliance standards and you have to notify your customers of that breach, that is going to do just irreparable harm to your reputation. It's going to erode the customer's trust in you. And we talked about some of those wonderful privacy laws a month or two ago here on Commerce Today. Now you can be open to lawsuits because, especially if you weren't PCI compliant and you had a breach, that is a very easy actionable item where someone can file a lawsuit under those state privacy laws. So I mentioned the biggest change is the customized approach. And if you want to shift to that customized approach, you have to identify the objective of each PCI requirement and then design a control that meets that objective. Document the rationale behind that control and how it meets that objective, and then have it assessed by a qualified security assessor, a QSA. That's who you've probably already been working with on your PCI compliance process. Those are just those experts that the payment card industry has certified as a qualified security assessor. So examples of a custom control, for instance, if you want to use an AI-driven intrusion detection system instead of a maybe more old school file integrity monitoring system, or if you want to implement a zero trust architecture that segments out the cardholder environment from the rest of your network, These are the kind of things, it's these innovations, especially around AI, that drove the change in these standards to allow you to define your own custom solutions and not have to just follow exactly what prescriptive measures were written into the standard. Now, document. When you're dealing with PCI compliance, it's best to document everything anyway. But under this customized approach to meeting version 4 of the standards, it's really important that you're documenting that detailed evidence that your control meets or exceeds the intent of the original requirement. Without that documentation, assessors can't certify compliance. And in the worst case, if you have a breach, that documentation is going to be super important in proving that you were compliant and did everything you could to prevent that breach. So the practical compliance checklist, again, I mentioned that there are a lot of companies out there that try to make a lot of money off of merchants by scaring them about PCI compliance. So very first thing I will say is make sure you even need to worry about PCI compliance. So how and where credit card data is processed determines what your exposure is and what your requirements are under PCI compliance. And I've worked with merchants that very intentionally used payment methods that maybe they don't provide the best user experience, but they, for instance, redirect entirely to PayPal and basically eliminate their PCI compliance burden or greatly reduce it by never even dealing with credit card data, never dealing with credit card information. It's never entered on their website. It's all done on PayPal's site. So that's the first step, is figure out, is this even something that you need to worry about? This is called scoping your environment. So identify where cardholder data is stored, where it's collected, where it's processed, where it's transmitted, and any systems that don't handle payments, you don't have to include in this PCI compliance environment. Now, I will say, I mentioned earlier, a lot of these new requirements are just IT security best practices. So don't just assume, okay, there's no credit card data there. But if your users' names, addresses, passwords are there, I would still apply these security best practices to those systems as well. Make sure you're using the right SAQ. This is the self-assessment questionnaire. Worked with a lot of merchants that use these, depending again on how your environment is set up and what sort of credit card data you're working with and where it's stored and transmitted. You can actually eliminate the need for that qualified security assessor, and you can do everything yourself through the self-assessment questionnaire. However, version 4 introduced major changes to the SAQ type. So there are a lot of merchants that are having to upgrade from the old SAQ-A, which was a lot simpler, to the SAQ-AEP or SAQ-D, especially, I'm going to get a little technical here, but especially if you're using iframes. Previously, under previous versions of the standard, iframes were a way that you remove things from your environment and your scope. That has changed in the new version. Also, make sure that you are documenting and monitoring all third-party scripts on your payment page. Document and maintain an inventory of all scripts running anywhere on your site. Knowing where those third-party scripts are can not only improve your security, but it can improve your site performance. Make sure you're using content security policies. I think all now major e-commerce platforms have updated to leverage this. So in theory, you probably have this as long as you are running on a current version. If you haven't updated your platform in a while, if you haven't updated your checkout code, things like that, then you might need to look at that. You can also use sub-resource integrity, SRI, to detect tampering. This also used to be known as two-factor authentication, but sometimes there's more than two factors, so it's multi-factor authentication. The standard says that all administrative access to cardholder data must be secured with multi-factor authentication. I would argue that all administrative accounts involved in your e-commerce business, you should just go ahead and set up multi-factor authentication. Make sure you're training your staff, update your security awareness training annually. Consider including phishing simulations or at least phishing examples and incident response drills. Plan for your assessments. Don't wait until you get a fine or you get increased merchant processing fees because your PCI compliance expired, especially if this is going to be your first renewal under version 4 and the version 4 requirements that went into place on March 31st of this year. Engage with a qualified security assessor if you're going to need to use one of those, especially if you're using that customized approach. So remember, PCI DSS 4.0 is now fully mandatory. No more loopholes, no more, oh, it's just a best practice. It is all required. Failure to comply with it can be very expensive, and that customized approach can give you a lot more flexibility if you properly document it. I would be more than happy. I'm not an official QSA, but I know a lot of them, and I have gone through the PCI compliance process a lot. So I am more than happy to have a free 30-minute call with you to talk through this or any other aspect of your e-commerce business. Those are not sales pitches. Those I use to inform content for my podcast and get to know new people in the e-commerce space. And who knows, it might even help with the next book now that I have finished and published the e-commerce growth playbook. So if you want one of those, or if you want more information on my book, find me on LinkedIn. My name is Joshua Warren. I have a Creativity Gold background behind my headshot, and I am looking forward to being back with you next week. So next week, we are going to talk about sales tax. There's been some big changes in 2025 in the world of sales tax for e-commerce businesses. And again, just like PCI compliance, not the most exciting topic, but it is important. It does have a